Welcome. This is the video lecture for elasticity. I'm Dr. Cherry. This video lecture will cover elasticities, introduce the concept, and then we'll look at a few specific types of elasticities: price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, and the cross price elasticity. So first, let's introduce the concept of elasticity. Elasticity is a quantitative measure of a relationship. A qualitative relationship is directional, and that's really what we've done up to this point. All the discussions that we've had about relationships and how a particular determinant affects supply or demand, we've talked about it in a qualitative manner, meaning we've only talked about the direction of the relationship, whether it's positive or negative. So for instance, we've discussed a price increase leads to a decrease in quantity demanded, meaning that the relationship, there's a negative relationship or an inverse relationship. A quantitative relationship is going to be more precise, and that's what elasticities allows us to do. It gives us a quantitative measure of that relationship. So instead of just simply saying that prices are negatively related to quantity demand, we can actually put a number to it. So it gives us something, it gives us an ability to say something like this: a 10% increase in a price leads to a 5% decrease in quantity demanded. Right? So it's the same thing, but it gives us a precision of the numbers. All right, so we're going to look at different elasticities, and each one is going to measure the relationship between two variables. And we're going to focus on four. The first we're going to look at is price elasticity of demand, and that's going to be denoted with a epsilon with a superscript P and a subscript D. And that's going to measure the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Then we're going to have income elasticity of demand, and that gives us the relationship between income and quantity demanded. And then we're going to have price elasticity of supply, and that's the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And then we're going to look at cross price elasticity of demand. And this is going to look at the relationship between the price of one good and the quantity demand of another good. So first, let's look at price elasticity of demand. What this measures is how much quantity demanded will change in response to a given change in price. In other words, it measures the responsiveness of the buyers to a price change. Like how much will quantity demand change in response to a price? That's simply saying, well, how are the buyers going to respond to a price change? And how do you calculate this? It's going to be equal to the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. You can imagine how this could be important if you own your own business, or if you're working for a firm and you have anything to do with determining the price levels for your products. And in setting prices, or in particular changing the price, you should know how buyers are going to respond to that price change. And that's exactly what the price elasticity of demand does for you. So the best way to understand the price elasticity of demand is essentially just doing a couple of examples. So here we're going to start with example number one. Suppose that the price of a pack of cigarette increases from $2 to $3. Right, so that's the price change. And what you're interested in is how will the buyers respond to that price change. So in this example, Joe Camel responds by reducing his quantity demanded from 50 to 40 packs a month. So how do you calculate the price elasticity demand? Well, you have the price change and you have the quantity demanded change. And then you're supposed to calculate what's the percentage change in quantity demand over the percentage change in price. First, to calculate the percentage change in quantity demanded, you would take 40 minus 50 over 50. And that follows the general formula on how to calculate a percentage change for anything. Right? It's the new number minus the old number over the old number. Right? And so that same general formula applies to the percentage change in price. 3 minus 2 over 2. And if you calculate this out, you end up with negative 0.2 over 0.5, which gives you negative 0.4. So negative 0.4 tells you a couple of things. First, the negative sign is consistent with the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded that we talked about before. So that's the qualitative aspect of this relationship. That negative sign is consistent with the law of demand. And a lot of times when we talk about price elasticity demand, we just ignore the negative sign because we know that it's always going to be negative. But 0.4, that gives you the precision of that relationship. So what does the 0.4 mean? All right, so as I said before, the negative sign corresponds with the law of demand, that negative relationship between price and quantity demand. But the 0.4 indicates that for every 1% change in price, quantity demand will change by 0.4 in the opposite direction. All right, so if the prices go up by 1%, quantity demand is going to go down by 0.4%. For an example that's listed here, if we see the price increase by 3%, we would expect to see the quantity demand fall by 1.2%. Another example, if we see the price fall by 10%, we would expect to see quantity demand to increase by 4%. So again, for every percentage change in price, the price elasticity demand gives you the corresponding change in quantity demanded. So for every 1% change in price, in this case, you get an opposite 0.4% change in quantity demand. So let's look at a second example. Now let's suppose that a price of a 12-pack of soda decreases from $5 to $3. And in response, Joe increases his quantity demanded from 2 to 3 packs per month. So again, let's calculate the price elasticity demand. We want the percentage change in price and the percentage change in quantity demanded, and they're calculated in this way. So percentage change in quantity demanded equals 3 minus 2 over 2. Again, that's the new number minus the old number over the old number. And that gives you 0.5. The percentage change in price is calculated by 3 minus 5 over 5, which gives you negative 0.4. Right, so 0.5 over negative 0.4 gives you negative 1.25. Right, so again, it's negative, indicating that the price and quantity demand are going to move in opposite directions, consistent with the law of demand. The 1.25 indicates that the buyers are going to be more responsive than they were in the previous example when it was 0.4, because we're interpreting it the same way. The 1.25 means that for every 1% change in price, buyers are going to respond by changing their quantity demand by 1.25%. So for example, if we see the price decrease by 2%, we would expect to see quantity demand to increase by 2.5%. Or another example, if the price increased by 10%, we would expect this to lead to a 12.5% decrease in quantity demanded. This illustrates that the negative sign is what we talked about previously, the qualitative relationship, that if prices go up, quantity demand is going to go down. But now we can actually say if prices go up by a certain amount, we have an estimate of how much quantity demand is going to change in response to that price change. And not all goods have the same elasticities, because buyers are going to respond to price changes differently for different goods. And we'll explain that more in just a second. So in these two examples, we talk about
just a price change and then a particular buyer's response. When you're actually looking at this to make a decision, you might get the data from thousands, tens of thousands of buyers and how each one responded, and then you find out the typical response from the buyers, so you get more of a general estimate of the elasticity. So price elasticity of demand can be categorized into different degrees of elasticity. There are 5. We're going to start with elastic. A good is considered to have elastic demand when the price elasticity demand is greater than 1. And what this means is that quantity demand is relatively responsive to the price change. Quantity demand changes in greater proportion than the price change itself. So what does an elastic demand curve look like? And it's going to be relatively flat. And if you think about it, a relatively flat demand curve means that you could have a relatively small change in price, and that could lead to big changes in quantity demanded. And that's really what elastic gets at. A good that has elastic demand is a good in which buyers will be very responsive to the price changes. So small changes in prices can lead to big changes in sales. The second example that we went through is a case of elastic demand. If you recall, it was 1.25. And I want to point out, when I say the price elasticity demand is greater than 1, we are talking about the price elasticity demand in absolute terms. I mentioned before, a lot of times we ignore that negative sign because it's always negative. We're ignoring the negative sign and we're only looking at the absolute values. Second degree of elasticity we call inelastic. And this is when the price elasticity demand is less than 1 in absolute terms. And what this suggests is that the quantity demanded is relatively unresponsive to price changes. Or in other words, the change in quantity demand is going to be smaller in proportion to the change in price. So what does an inelastic demand curve look like? It's going to be steep. And you can see graphically, you can have a big change in price, relatively big change in price, and that will lead to a relatively small change in quantity demand. Right? So this is going to be the type of good where you can have a price change and it's going to have a relatively small effect on sales. So the first example that we went through is a case of inelastic demand. If you recall, that price elasticity demand was 0.4 in absolute terms. So the third case of elasticity is what we call perfectly inelastic. And that's when price elasticity demand is equal to 0. And if you recall how to interpret the price elasticity demand, if for every 1% change in price, quantity demand is going to change 0%. In other words, it's not going to respond at all to a price change. Perfectly inelastic good is one in which quantity demand is not responsive to price changes. So what does this look like if we graph it out? And that's going to be a vertical demand curve. You can see graphically, you can pick any price, change it from one point to another point, and you're not going to change the quantity demanded. This is a special case of inelastic demand. You can think of a couple of examples. Some healthcare, life-saving healthcare, it doesn't really matter what the price is, you're going to purchase it. Insulin for diabetics, those things that you need, and price is not an issue. So the fourth case is a perfectly elastic, which is a special case of elastic demand. And that's when the price elasticity demand is undefined. In this case, quantity demand can have no response
to a price change, or it can have an extreme response. So there'll be a switching point. You either buy all you need or you don't buy anything. There's no marginal decision making. So what does that look like? That's when the demand curve is perfectly horizontal. Right? So then if the price is above the demand curve, you don't buy anything. And if the price is at or below, then you buy everything you need. All right, so these cases that fall under this category might be goods with perfect substitutes. The price rises and you switch over to the other alternative. And if the price falls below some point, then you switch back. And then the fifth and final category of elasticity is something called unit elastic. And it's also a special case. And it's the switching point between elastic and inelastic. And that's when the price elasticity demand is equal to 1. And what this indicates is that quantity demanded will have an equal proportional response to the price change. So quantity demand changes in the same proportion as the price change. For example, if price increases by 3%, quantity demanded is going to decrease by 3%. They move in the same proportions. So the demand curve for unit elastic is non-linear and it can be somewhat confusing, so we're not going to discuss that. So just to review a bit, we have 5 categories, 2 broad categories, elastic and inelastic, but then we have 3 special cases: perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic, and unit elastic. So what determines the elasticity for a particular good? There are 3 of them, and we're going to begin with necessities versus luxuries. Necessities are generally inelastic, luxuries are generally elastic. And really what that's getting at is, can you do without that particular good or service? And of course, this is partly determined by the preferences or needs of the particular buyer. Some examples of necessities would be milk, particularly if you have children, bread, gas. And these are goods that buyers are not going to be very responsive to the price changes. So the gas price goes up, but we still need gas to go to work, go to school, and move around. So we're still going to buy gas. Maybe not to the same extent we were purchasing it before, but we're not as flexible to respond to price changes. On the other hand, you have luxuries, which might be entertainment, like dinner out, buying a boat, or going to the movie. Those things, they're luxuries in the sense that we do not need them. We could do without them, and so we're going to be more responsive to price changes in those for those good types of goods. What's the second determinant of elasticity? And that's the availability of close substitutes. More alternatives will lead to more elastic demand. And what that means is that when there's more alternatives, there's more opportunities and it's easier to adjust your purchasing behavior. If you have few or no alternatives, then that's going to lead to more inelastic demand. And without those alternatives, or if there aren't as many to choose from, it's harder to switch. So for your car, one reason why gas is inelastic is that there aren't many substitutes for gas. So the third category is time horizon. The longer the time horizon, the more elastic the demand is. And that's because as time passes, you have more opportunities to change your purchasing patterns. So in the short run, demand is going to be less elastic than it will be in the long run. So for examples, consider gas or energy in general. In the short run, you're more stuck in your situation. You have your car, you have your house, and it's more difficult to get out of that purchasing pattern.
In the long run, though, the next time you buy a car, you could get one that's more fuel efficient. Next time you buy a new house, pick a new apartment to rent, you could pick one closer to work so you don't have to drive as far. Or the next time your house needs a new heating system, you could pick one that's more fuel efficient or more energy efficient. So those things. And another example is cigarettes. Maybe it's hard to quit smoking cigarettes in the short run, but in the long run, you have time to succeed. So summary, we covered 3 determinants of elasticity, and each determinant really gets at one basic issue, and this is how difficult is it to buyers to stop buying or consuming the good in question. If the consumer is stuck in consuming that good, then the price change will have less of an impact. If the consumer is not stuck, then the price change will have a larger effect. If it's easier to stop consuming, the more responsive quantity demand will be to the price. So it all gets back to how easy it is to stop consuming or substituting away from that purchase. And those 3 determinants, whether it's a necessity or a luxury, whether there are available substitutes, and time horizon, they all get at this fundamental question. So now let's look at price elasticity demand in the context of total revenue. As I talked about before, if you're running a business or have some voice in a pricing decision, you should know how a price change will affect your total revenue. So we're going to go through this and see how elasticities play a role in this. So what is total revenue? Simply the total number of units sold multiplied times the selling price. So it's P times Q. So for example, suppose that a movie house sells 40,000 tickets during a month and the price is $15 per ticket. So what's the total revenue during this month? It's 15 times 40,000, that gives you $600,000. That's the revenue. Graphically, you can see that it's just that shaded area. So how does a price change affect this total revenue? If you increase prices, will total revenue go up or down? It's not clear unless you know the elasticity. If you know the elasticities, you can answer that question. If it's elastic, if you remember what that means, elastic is when buyers are going to be responsive to price changes. Right? In this case, an increase in price is going to decrease total revenue. So price and total revenue are negatively related to one another. And this makes some sense because if you increase prices on buyers that are really responsive to price changes, you're going to lose a lot of sales. And that's going to negatively affect your total revenue. So here's an example. Price increases by $2. Let's say it goes from $18 to $20. In response, quantity demanded is going to decrease 10 units from 20 to 10. Thus, that price increase caused a total revenue decline of $160. Right? It's fallen from $360 to $200. All right, so now let's look at the inelastic case. If you recall, inelastic demand means that good has buyers that are not very responsive to price changes. Right? So an increase in price on buyers that are more stuck or less responsive, it's going to increase your total revenue. So price and total revenue are positively related for goods that have inelastic demand. Right? And this makes some sense, because increasing prices on buyers that are less able to not buy that good is likely to increase your total revenue. So here's an example. Let's suppose that price increases by $5 from $20 to $25. And this leads to a quantity demanded change of 1 unit, say from 11 to 10. So you can see graphically the price increase is going to generate more additional revenue than what's lost in the declining sales. So the price increase is going to cause total revenue to increase in this case. Now it says here 160, but that's a typo because the total revenue goes from 220 to 250, so total revenue increased by $30, not 160. All right, so what about unit elastic? In this case, a change in price will not change total revenue. Price and total revenue are unrelated to one another. So if you increase or decrease price, total revenue is not going to change. And this is a special case. And this makes sense because the proportional changes are equal, so any negative impact from reduced sales is going to be perfectly offset by the gains in revenue from the higher prices, or vice versa. The lost revenue from lower prices are going to be perfectly offset from the gains in sales. All right, now we're going to move to income elasticity demand. And we're going to go a bit more quickly through this because it's going to be similar to the price elasticity demand. The only difference is we're looking at income instead of prices. So here we're looking at how much does quantity demand change in response to a change in income. So it measures the responsiveness of buyers to changes in income. Before we looked at how buyers respond to changes in prices, this gives us how buyers respond to changes in income. And it's calculated in a similar way. It's a percentage change in quantity demand over the percentage change in income. Again, the only difference is you're looking at the percentage change in income instead of percentage change in price. What the income elasticity does, it allows us to differentiate between normal goods and inferior goods. We talked about that before when we were going through the determinants of demand, and we introduced the concept of normal versus inferior goods. Now we can quantify it. Normal goods are those goods with the income elasticity demand greater than 0. Income and quantity demand are positively related. So the more income you have, the more quantity demanded. Inferior goods, that's when income elasticity demand is less than 0. Income and quantity demand are negatively related. Right, so we talked about that before, income and quantity demand being negatively related. That's the definition of inferior good. But what income elasticity demand is going to tell us to what extent is it an inferior good. So the income elasticity demand allows us to quantify this concept of normal and inferior goods. All right, so let's look at price elasticity of supply. Here we're looking at how much quantity supplied changes in response to a price change. So this differs from the price elasticity demand because we're looking at quantity supplied instead of quantity demanded. Now we're looking at the responsiveness of the sellers to a change in price. Not the responsiveness to buyers, but the responsiveness of sellers to the change in price. All right, so the price elasticity demand was looking at the demand side of the market, how buyers respond to price changes. The price elasticity of supply is looking at the supply side of the market. So it's looking at how the sellers are responding to price changes. Calculate it in a similar way. It's the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. So let's do an example. Suppose that the price of a pint of milk increases from $1 to $1.25. In response, producers increase their quantity supplied from 50,000 to 75,000 pints. So in this case, the price changes. So that part of the example looks like the price elasticity demand example. You have a price change. But the difference here is the response we're looking at is how did the sellers, the producers, respond to this price change? Whereas before we were looking at how the buyers responded. So it's calculated the same way. 75,000 minus 50,000 over 50,000. That gives you the percentage change in quantity supplied. Then you have the percentage change in price. 1.25 minus 1 over 1. And that gives you 0.5 over 0.25, which equals 2. So what does this mean? First of all, you have a positive sign, and that is consistent with the law of supply. Right? Prices go up, quantity supplied is going to go up. If prices go down, quantity supplied is going to go down. They move in the same direction. So that's the positive sign, that positive relationship. But what does the 2 mean? It's interpreted the same way as the price elasticity demand case. For every 1% change in price, in this case we have a 2% change in quantity supplied. Right? So the price elasticity supplied gives you, for every percent change in price, it gives you the percent change in quantity supplied. So another example, if the price elasticity supplied is 2, like it is here, if we see prices increase by 5%, we would expect to see quantity supplied to increase by 10%. So essentially, it being 2 means that you're going to get twice the response in quantity supplied as for any given change in price. Alright, so let's look at degrees of elasticity for this price elasticity supply. So we're looking at the degrees of elasticity for the supply side of the market. And you're going to have the same categories that we did for the demand side of the market. We're going to start with elastic, and they're going to be interpreted the same way, except for you're just looking at the producers instead of the consumers. That's the difference. So if it's elastic, that means that the price elasticity supply is greater than 1. And that indicates that the producers are relatively responsive to the price changes. And that's going to be represented with a relatively flat supply curve. Inelastic supply means that price elasticity supply is less than 1. And this means that the producers are not very responsive to price changes. And that's going to be illustrated with a relatively steep supply curve. And then we have the perfectly elastic case, and that's when price elasticity supplied is undefined. And that means price changes can lead to large swings in quantity supplied. And this is going to be illustrated graphically by a horizontal supply curve. And then we have perfectly inelastic supply. And that's when price elasticity supply equals 0. And that indicates that producers are not responsive to the price changes. And that's going to be a vertical supply curve on the graph. So perfectly inelastic demand was a vertical demand curve. Perfectly inelastic supply is a vertical supply curve. Both indicating that the respective side of the market is not responsive to a price change. All right, so cross price elasticity demand. This measures how responsive quantity demanded of one good is to a price change of another good. So if you remember when we went through the determinants of demand, we talked about substitutes and complements, related goods, and how the price of one good can affect the demand of another good. That's what this measure of elasticity is getting at. Cross-price elasticity measures the responsiveness of the buyers to one good to the price change of another good. So how do you calculate this? It looks very similar to the first price elasticity demand that we covered. But for cross-price elasticity of demand, we have the percentage change in quantity demand of one good, say X, and that's over the percentage change in price of another good, say Y. Percentage change in quantity demand of one good over the percentage change in price of the related good. So as I mentioned, cross-price elasticity gets at the idea of substitutes and complements. When the cross-price elasticity demand is positive, greater than 0, then we have a substitute. Right? Quantity demanded is positively related to the price of a substitute. We covered that initially in the determinants of demand. But with this elasticity, we can actually measure how strong of a substitute those two goods are. Right? So when the price of digital cable decreases, the quantity demanded of basic cable decreases. Complements, that's defined by when cross-price elasticity demand is negative. That's when quantity demanded is negatively related to the price of a complement. An example would be when the price of a lift ticket increases, the quantity demanded of ski rentals decrease. Right? So these are the goods you buy together.